A Porter's Lake Christmas. As the days grew shorter and the temperature dropped, you knew it would soon be Christmas. Did you know December 21st is the shortest day of the year? Which is the longest? All these thoughts were rattling around the young minds of Cecil and Noble as they helped their grandfathers hitch up Prince to the old red sleigh. Someday I've got to fix up the sleigh before it's too late, thought their grandfather. Prince was an old horse of 16 years with the heart of an 8-year-old. Oh yeah, and he was a guy horse. So today they were going to get the Christmas tree, but in a most unusual way. In the sleigh, under the seat, was the axe, bow saw, and some unusual spikes with straps of leather for attaching to boots. Off old Prince roared with 4 aboard into the woodlot. After about half an hour of searching and letting Prince have his rein, the perfect tree was located. The only problem was it was 30 feet up in the air, on the top of another tree. On with the spikes up the tree went their grandfather. He had the axe and bow attached to a rope he had tied to his waist. A few well-placed axe cuts and cross cuts with the saw, and down came a perfect Christmas tree on a rope. You didn't want to break any boughs. In less than 20 minutes, old Prince was back in the barn eating oats. Cecil and Noble's dad soon had a stand made out of 2x4s attached to the perfect Christmas tree. Out in the country, everyone made their own tree stand this way. So far, a perfect start to a Christmas holiday. That afternoon was a postcard of real beauty. The lake was well frozen by now. The sun was shining. A perfect day for skating. Granddad didn't have skates like everyone else's. His skates were pieces of wood with metal blades attached to them. He would strap them to his boots. Used to them, he would say, and they kept your feet warmer. What a great place to skate. They could skate straight through ahead for hours without turning if they so desired. So, of course, Noble and Cecil had to have a race. It was a little bumpy, and as they came racing around a small island, Cecil, who was in the lead, suddenly slipped and went sprawling flat out and straight into the open water, hidden from view by trees on the island. Noble stopped just in time to see Cecil laying spread-eagled on the water, motionless, as he had been taught. Immediately, Noble turned around and went for help. Already their dad had a long pole in tow, and soon they had fished out a cold, shivering, and embarrassed boy. Cecil went straight back to the farm at full speed, so as not to get hypothermia. His grandmother meted him with smiles and concern. He was soon wrapped up in a warm blanket in front of the big pot-bellied stove in the sitting room. Wow, what a day. He had won the race and survived his first ever winter swim. The next day, Cecil and Noble were awakened before the sun had risen. They had a warm breakfast of boiled oats covered in molasses, almost like Prince. There was a lot of clunking and horse-whinnying sounds coming from the barnyard. They finished breakfast quickly. They were most curious to discover the reasons behind these sounds. As they approached the snow-covered yard, they saw Prince in the final stages of hitching up to it looked like part of a sleigh. There was half of a sleigh with runners and a second half chained to the first. On both sections were attached 2 long poles, almost 6 feet high. Whatever could this be used for? There wasn't even a place to sit. Noble proudly held Prince's reins as they all walked along beside the strange sleigh. They were heading towards the woodlot. The sleigh had to have something to do with the trees, they figured. They were going to pick up some of the felled trees that had their boughs removed with an axe. They were now called logs. Prince was unhitched from the sleigh, and the second sleigh unchained from the first and placed 20 feet behind the first part. A long chain was attached to Prince's halter. Each of the men carried a 6-foot pole with a hook of steel attached to the end. The 2 brothers had watched their grandfather make them out in a blacksmith shop. He had made them out of scrap metal and formed them with a hammer once the metal was red hot on the anvil. Using the hook poles, which were called peaveys, the men pushed the logs together in a pile of 4 or 5. Then they would attach the choker chain from Prince's halter along the log piles and pull them crossways onto the 2 sleighs. Prince was especially frisky today, and their grandfather had to reattach the choker several times, as Prince wanted to work too quickly. Both boys wondered if anyone else had a horse that always wanted to work too quickly. Soon they were back at the sleigh with all the logs. Prince dragged the logs onto the first sleigh after the poles were removed. Then he pulled the other end of the log onto the second sleigh. The first few logs were then chained into place so the two sleighs became one long one. As the pile of logs became higher on the sleigh, they were often PV'd into place. When no more logs could be loaded, Prince was hitched up to the logging sleigh. They could now sit on top of the load. This time, no one had to worry about Prince going too fast, as the load was very heavy. Back to the wood pile they went, where the logs would eventually be made into firewood. Most of the logs were either birch or spruce. There were a few Christmas trees also. Their real name is fir. Along with the spruce and the pine trees, they were called evergreens. Their scientific name is coniferous or cone-bearing. Their grandfather called them softwood trees. They were used to make kindling, to start the fire, and the larger softwood pieces to keep it going. When the fire was good and hot, you would add the hardwood or deciduous leaf-dropping pieces as they burned slowly. In the fall, the logs were cut with a long double-handled saw with a man at each end into lengths that could be carried. All the relatives who lived nearby had years ago bought an old Ford tractor with a power takeoff that they used to cut the logs into firewood. It had a long belt made of canvas that ran back to a large circular saw that sat behind a pivoted table that would tip forward into that noisy, dangerous saw. Cecil and Noble's great-uncle Jim used to help them on this saw. He had only one eye. He had lost the other in the famous Halifax explosion of 1917. He was a real character that Cecil and Nobles were always afraid of. He had the nasty habit of chewing and spitting tobacco. This did not make for very white teeth. He wasn't all that friendly with children and had a very reputation for being lazy. That night the two brothers slept well. It had been a long and interesting day. The next day they awoke to find the windows completely covered in frost. They put pennies on the glass and held them there with their fingers until the ice melted around them. Then they would stay stuck on the glass. After the morning fire was made, they would find the pennies on the floor or sill as the rooms warmed up. During the night, over 2 feet of snow had fallen, and the driveway and the path to their cousin's house was blocked. Granddad had already started to plow the driveway to the farmhouse on his homemade plow that Prince was pulling. More than once he fell face first into the snow. I guess it needed some more development work. Across the field, they could see their cousins playing in the yard, making these huge snowmen. Their names were Billy and Gerald. After Prince had plowed the path to the old cottage, they ran over to join in the fun. When they arrived, Billy was cutting blocks of snow to make an igloo. They stacked the blocks one upon the other and held each in place by packing snow between them. After several hours, they were getting cold and wet and had nearly finished when their Aunt Rita called them in for a hot chocolate and to dry off their mittens and toques. Their cousin's home used to sit down beside the lake. However, over the past few springs, the lake had flooded, so their Uncle Ernie had decided to relocate the house up the hill, out of the water's way. At one time it had been a small cottage, but when it was moved up the hill, it gained a sun porch and a bedroom, plus a basement. At the present time, the basement floor was made of sand, just perfect for playing with toy dump trucks and bulldozers. From the kitchen, you could still see the marks that Uncle Ernie had painted on the bridge timbers beneath the roadway. The highest watermark was a brass plaque Uncle Ernie had made in the machine shop. It noted the year, month, and gain in height. It was only a few feet from the roadway. Fortunately, the house had been moved before that flood. Their cousin's house was always the best decorated of any home in Porter's Lake at Christmas. Last summer, Uncle Ernie had restored their grandfather's old horse-drawn buggy. He placed it out in front of the house for all to see as they passed on the highway. It was now stored in the barn along with an old planked, double-oared lifeboat that they used to row to Sandy Point in the summer. Aunt Rita had the neatest lights on the Christmas tree in the front room. A few minutes after the lights warmed up, little bubbles were starting to go up from the base of these candles. Much time was spent watching and counting the light with the fastest or greatest number of bubbles. At their own home, they recall their father wiring the Christmas tree to the wall with hooks, so when their pet cat Ginger decided he had to sniff the angel, the tree didn't come crashing to the floor. Sometimes their dad would get a less than perfect tree and would then drill holes into the tree and add extra boughs. Both boys wondered if any other dad took Christmas trees that seriously. On the other hand, their grandparents had only 2 wreaths with 1 electric candle, no bubbles, each. When the family wasn't staying over for Christmas, the tree was just a little fella about 2 feet tall. I guess that's what happens when you get old. Sometimes their grandparents wouldn't even open all of their gifts. Didn't have to, their grandfather would say. I know what they are. But how could they be so sure? That night was the night before Christmas, and both Cecil and Noble were allowed to stay up a little later than usual. Around 10 o'clock, their grandfather arrived on foot to take the boys back to the farm. Of course, it was dark. Instead of a flashlight, their grandfather had the kerosene lantern, his best polished brass one, for it was a special night. It threw a good light, but was rather spooky, as the shadows that followed them were long and bouncy. Soon they were ready for bed. They had their special extra warm pajamas with feet sewn in them. They would never have worn them at home without much protest. For babies, they would have said. But on the farm, warmth was ahead of all else. Extra quilts were welcome too, as there was no heat in any of the upstairs bedrooms except for that which came up the squeaky stairway. They both had great difficulty getting to sleep, as they were so excited. When they were almost asleep, they were sure they heard the sounds of reindeer hooves on the roof. They lay very still, listening very intently, for they knew if you got up to see Santa, he may not leave you any gifts. But the sounds were not coming from the roof. They were coming from the barnyard. With their quilts wrapped around them, they slowly opened their window. And what should they see? A barnyard full of hundreds of toys. They had wished for a lot, but surely not this much. Besides, said Cecil, I can see girl stuff. Unknown to the boys, Santa had had some serious sleigh problems when one of the runners had broken and it had punched a hole in the bottom of the sleigh, and out fell many toys. The boys kept looking when suddenly they saw Santa, and they were sure he had looked their way. Quickly they shut the window and got back into bed. Neither said a word, and were soon asleep. When they woke up the next morning, they raced downstairs, and beneath the tree, nothing. No presents, not even coal in their stockings. Soon their parents awoke to find both boys with long faces and tears in their eyes. Slowly, Cecil and Noble told them what they had seen earlier that morning, and they were so sorry Santa had seen them. Then they heard the door close as their grandfather came into the house. He went straight over to his son and whispered in his ear. Their dad smiled, and soon everybody was smiling, except Cecil and Noble. After they had dressed, they were out in the barn looking at their grandfather's brilliant red sleigh. It looked just like new. Attached to the seat was a note from Santa to the grandfather, thanking him for the use of his sleigh. The 2 brothers were excited for their grandfather having such a nice sleigh, but they still couldn't help but show their disappointment over no toys. Their grandfather asked them to both jump up in the seat and see if the spring still squeaked. As they jumped up and down in silence, they suddenly squealed with delight. The whole back of the sleigh was filled with gifts for everyone. After they had taken all the gifts into the house, their dad read the rest of the note from Santa, explaining that as this was his busiest night, he had no time to ask to borrow the sleigh and no time left to put gifts in the house, and ended the note with no peeking and Merry Christmas to all. Ho, ho, ho!